The wind howled across the frozen expanse, biting through the trees and carrying with it the eerie silence of the abandoned lake. The surface, a vast sheet of ice, stretched endlessly beneath the moon's cold glow. And there, in the middle of the frozen wilderness, was a sight that would break even the hardest of hearts. A German shepherd, her fur matted with frost, curled protectively around her tiny, shivering puppies. No one knew exactly how they had ended up there. Perhaps she had been searching for shelter, or maybe she had been abandoned, left to fend for herself in the brutal cold. Whatever the reason, the mother dog had done everything in her power to shield her young from the biting temperatures, using her own body as a barrier between them and the merciless wind. But time was running out. Miles away, in a small rescue shelter, a call came in that would change everything. A lone fisherman, out checking his gear near the frozen shoreline, had spotted something unusual on the ice. At first, he thought it was just a dark shape, maybe a fallen tree or a patch of disturbed snow. But as he squinted against the icy gust, he saw the faint movement, ears twitching, a head lifting slightly, and then the telltale sight of a tail wrapped tightly around something small. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just any stranded animal. This was a mother fighting for the lives of her young. Frantically, he reached for his phone, fingers numb as he dialed the nearest animal rescue team. The dispatcher's voice was calm but urgent, asking for details, location, condition, how many were trapped. Every second counted in temperatures this low. If they didn't act fast, the ice could crack beneath them, or worse, the cold would claim them before help could arrive. As the rescue team scrambled into action, racing against time and the elements, the mother dog lifted her head, ears twitching. A distant sound, a promise of hope, cut through the silence. But would they get there in time? The ice groaned under the weight of the wind, a haunting sound that echoed across the frozen lake. The German shepherd shifted, pulling her shivering puppies closer to her chest. Her breath came in labored puffs, each exhale forming delicate clouds in the bitter night air. She had been here for hours, maybe longer. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but her only concern was keeping her puppies alive. A sudden gust of wind sent a spray of loose snow across the ice, and the mother dog's ears perked up. She was alert despite her exhaustion, her instincts razor-sharp. Something was coming. In the small fishing town on the outskirts of the forest, a local rescue team was already gearing up. The call from the fisherman had sent a jolt of urgency through the station. The dispatcher's voice had been firm, but there was no disguising the concern in her tone. "There's a dog stranded on the ice," she had said, "with puppies." That was all it took. Within minutes, a team of 3 rescuers piled into their truck, sirens off but speed high. They knew the risks. Frozen lakes were treacherous this time of year. One wrong step, and they could be plunging into the frigid water themselves. But they didn't hesitate. Meanwhile, the fisherman who had spotted the dogs paced at the shoreline. He had tried to venture closer, but the ice creaked dangerously under his boots, forcing him to retreat. He could still see them. The mother's dark fur barely visible against the snow, her body curled protectively around the puppies. She wasn't moving much. That was what scared him most. By the time the rescue team arrived, the temperature had dropped even further. The team leader, Jake, grabbed his binoculars and scanned the lake. His jaw clenched when he saw the German shepherd and her litter still in the same spot. "She's weak," he murmured. "We don't have much time." They quickly assessed the situation. The ice was thick but unpredictable. The weight of several grown men could be too much, but they couldn't just leave the dogs there. "We'll have to go slow," said Sarah, one of the rescuers. "Spread our weight as much as possible." Jake nodded. "We'll use the sled." They unstrapped a rescue sled from the truck, a lightweight board with ropes attached for pulling. It was usually meant for people, but tonight it would be the lifeline for a mother and her puppies. Jake went first, carefully stepping onto the ice, his weight evenly distributed. Sarah followed, dragging the sled behind her. The third rescuer, Mark, stayed at the edge, holding the safety rope in case they needed to be pulled back quickly. The ice groaned under their careful movements. Each step felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. Halfway across, The mother dog lifted her head weakly. Her eyes, dark and full of fear, locked onto Jake. "It's okay, girl," he called softly, inching closer. "We're here to help." She didn't move, either too exhausted or too afraid to react. The puppies stirred slightly, whimpering, their tiny bodies huddled together for warmth. Sarah exhaled sharply. "They're freezing." Jake reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a piece of jerky, extending it toward the mother. "Come on, girl," he coaxed. "We need to get you out of here." She hesitated, then sniffed the air. Hunger won out over fear. Slowly, shakily, she lifted herself just enough to reach for the food. It was the opening they needed. Sarah moved quickly, scooping up the first puppy and wrapping it in a warm towel. The mother tensed but didn't growl. She was too weak to fight. One at a time, Jake instructed. "Keep it slow." They carefully placed each puppy onto the sled, wrapping them tightly. The mother let out a low whine, watching as they were taken from her side. Then, just as Jake reached out to her, the ice gave a sudden, sharp crack. Everything happened in a flash. The mother yelped as the ground beneath her buckled. Jake lunged forward, grabbing her scruff just as the ice shattered beneath her weight. Cold water exploded around them. Jake gritted his teeth as the icy grip of the lake swallowed his legs. He held tight to the dog, his arms straining to keep her above the surface. She thrashed weakly, her body barely holding onto the strength to fight. "Jake!" Sarah screamed. "I got her!" he shouted back, voice shaking from the cold. "Pull the sled back. Get the puppies to safety." Sarah hesitated for only a second before obeying. She gripped the rope and started pulling, dragging the sled and the fragile puppies towards solid ground. Jake, meanwhile, was in a battle against time. His muscles burned from the freezing temperature, but he refused to let go of the mother dog. If she went under, she wouldn't come back up. "Come on, girl," he gasped, tightening his hold. "You're not dying today." Mark, still on the shore, threw out a second safety rope. "Jake, grab it." Jake couldn't. His hands were full with the dog. Instead, he wrapped the rope around his arm and held tight. "Pull us in." Mark didn't hesitate. With every ounce of strength he had, he started pulling them back towards solid ice. The mother dog stopped struggling, her body limp against Jake's chest. She was slipping away. "No, no, no," Jake muttered. "Stay with me." Just as he thought she had lost consciousness, something incredible happened. With the last bit of energy left in her body, the mother dog weakly lifted her head and latched onto Jake's coat with her teeth. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was her way of saying, "I'm not giving up yet." The team pulled harder, inch by inch, until finally Jake felt solid ground beneath him again. He gasped for air as Sarah and Mark yanked him fully onto safe ice. The mother dog collapsed beside him, her body trembling. "She's alive," Sarah breathed, quickly wrapping her in a blanket. "But we need to move fast." They didn't waste a second. The puppies, now wrapped in warm towels, were tucked into Sarah's coat for extra warmth. Jake and Mark carried the mother onto the sled, securing her tightly. Then, carefully, they made their way back to shore. The moment they reached safety, the rescue truck's doors flew open. The team rushed the dogs inside, cranking up the heat. The mother dog barely opened her eyes, but her puppies nestled against her once more, their tiny bodies finally safe and warm. Hours later, at the shelter, the vet confirmed what the rescuers already knew. The mother had been on the brink of death. Without their intervention, she and her puppies wouldn't have lasted another night. But against all odds, she had survived. And in the weeks that followed, as she regained her strength, she never let her rescuers out of her sight. She knew they had saved her. And in return, she had given them something they would never forget, a reminder of just how powerful a mother's love can be, even in the face of death. The storm arrived that night. Thick snowflakes swirled against the shelter's windows, illuminated by the dim outside lights. Inside, the rescued German shepherd and her puppies lay wrapped in warm blankets. The mother, though exhausted and still recovering, had started eating again, her strength returning bit by bit. The puppies, once limp and barely moving, now huddled close, their tiny whimpers filling the quiet room. Jake sat nearby, unable to take his eyes off them. Something about this dog haunted him. He had rescued dozens of strays before, but there was something different about her. The way she had clung to him in the ice-cold water. The way she had held onto his coat with her last ounce of strength. And the way she was looking at him now, deep, knowing eyes locked onto his, as if she were trying to tell him something. "She's been through hell," Sarah murmured from the other side of the room. "But she's a fighter." Jake nodded, but didn't speak. There was more to it than that. This dog hadn't just survived. She had waited. Waited in that exact spot on the ice, through the bitter cold, through starvation, through exhaustion. She had refused to leave. But why? He studied her closely. Her fur was thick and healthy, though dirted from her ordeal. She wasn't a street dog. She had belonged to someone. But there was no collar, no microchip. Just those eyes that held a silent plea. She knew something, and she needed them to know it too. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Jake arrived at the shelter early. He wasn't sure why. He just had a feeling like something wasn't right. As soon as he stepped inside, he froze. The German Shepherd was pacing in her pen, her puppies nestled safely in their blankets. But she wasn't focused on them. Her eyes were locked on him the moment he entered, ears perked, tail stiff, body tense. Then she barked. Once. Sharp. Urgent. Jake blinked. "Hey, girl. What's wrong?" She barked again, this time trotting toward the kennel door. When he didn't move fast enough, she whined, scratching at the gate. Sarah, who had just walked in, raised an eyebrow. "She's acting weird." Jake didn't answer. He moved to unlock the pen, kneeling as he did. The moment the latch clicked, the German Shepherd nosed the door open herself and bolted straight to him. Not in fear, not in desperation, but with purpose. She circled him, then barked again, more forcefully this time. Then she trotted to the shelter's exit, looking back at him. She wanted him to follow. Jake stood slowly, exchanging a glance with Sarah. "I think she's trying to tell us something." Sarah hesitated. "She's still weak. If she gets lost." "She won't," Jake interrupted. "She knows exactly where she's going." There was something unshakable about the dog's behavior. It wasn't random, wasn't frantic. It was focused. And Jake had spent enough time with search and rescue dogs to know when an animal was leading him towards something. Something important. With her puppies safely in Sarah's care, the mother dog led Jake outside. The storm from the night before had left a thick layer of snow, making it difficult to track anything. But she didn't hesitate. She moved swiftly, weaving through the town's outskirts, heading toward the forest. Her pace was quick, but she glanced back every few steps, making sure Jake was keeping up. His breath came out in white clouds, boots crunching against the frozen ground. "Where are you taking me, girl?" She didn't answer. Of course, she couldn't. But somehow, he felt that she wanted to. For nearly an hour, she led him through the woods. The wind howled, but she never slowed. Jake's mind raced as he followed. Had she been abandoned out here? Had her owner left her behind? Or was there something worse waiting at the end of this path? Then suddenly she stopped. Jake nearly ran into her. She stood at the edge of a clearing, ears forward, body frozen. Jake followed her gaze, and his stomach dropped. A small, half-buried cabin lay ahead. The snow had nearly swallowed it, and if he hadn't been looking directly at it, he wouldn't have noticed the slumped-over figure just outside the door. A person. Jake ran. He didn't think, he just moved. The shepherd followed closely, her breath coming in sharp bursts. When he reached the cabin's doorstep, he saw the truth. An older man, wrapped in tattered clothing, was slumped against the wall, barely breathing. His skin was pale, lips cracked and blue. He had been out here too long in the cold. And right next to him, partially covered in snow, was a broken leash. Jake's chest tightened. This was her owner. She hadn't been abandoned. She had been waiting for him, waiting for help, waiting for someone to notice. And she had refused to leave. Jake dropped to his knees, shaking the man's shoulders. "Hey, can you hear me?" A faint groan. Weak. Barely there. Jake didn't waste a second. He grabbed his radio, calling for emergency responders. His heart pounded as he checked the man's pulse. Faint, but still there. The man was severely hypothermic, but he was alive. And the only reason he was alive was because his dog had never given up on him. By the time the paramedics arrived, the German Shepherd hadn't moved from her owner's side. She nuzzled his hand, whining softly, as if telling him to hold on just a little longer. The rescue team worked fast, lifting the man onto a stretcher, wrapping him in heat blankets. One of the paramedics turned to Jake, shaking his head in amazement. If you hadn't found him now, he wouldn't have lasted another hour. Jake looked down at the dog, his throat tight. I didn't find him. She did. Later, in the hospital, the story came together. The man, a retired forest ranger, had set out to gather supplies days earlier when a sudden storm hit. A fall on the ice left him unable to walk. He had crawled back to the cabin, but had lost too much strength. His only hope was his dog. But instead of running away, she had stayed. For days, she had curled around her puppies, enduring the cold, hoping someone would find them. And when help finally arrived, she had known exactly what to do. She had led them home. The German Shepherd and her puppies made a full recovery. And when her owner woke up, the first thing he saw was his loyal companion by his bedside, tail wagging, eyes filled with love. Jake stood by the door, watching. He had seen incredible rescues before, but this one was different. This wasn't just survival. This was faith. This dog had refused to give up, even when the world turned against her. She had held on. For her puppies. For herself. For the man she loved. And in the end, she had done what no one else could. She had saved a life. The hospital room was quiet, save for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. The old man lay in the hospital bed, his breath still shallow but stronger than before. His fingers twitched slightly, his body fighting to return from the brink of death. At his bedside, the German Shepherd sat alert, her deep brown eyes never leaving him. She didn't whimper. She didn't move. She simply waited, just as she had on that frozen lake, just as she had for days, enduring hunger and cold to protect her puppies and hold on to the last shred of hope that help would come. And now, finally it had. Jake stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the moment unfold. He had seen miraculous rescues before. He had pulled people from burning buildings, dragged bodies from floodwaters, and saved animals from impossible situations. But this was different. This was more than just survival. This was love, pure, unwavering, and unbreakable. A low groan escaped the man's cracked lips. The shepherd's ears perked up instantly. She rose to her feet, moving closer, her nose nudging his hand ever so gently. His fingers twitched. Jake held his breath. Another groan, a slow, sluggish inhale. Then, his eyes fluttered open. For a moment, there was only confusion, a blurry gaze scanning the unfamiliar room, the scent of antiseptic, the hum of machines. But then his eyes landed on her. The German Shepherd, his loyal companion, his savior. His lips parted, voice barely above a whisper. Maya. The dog let out a low, shuddering whine, her entire body trembling as she pressed herself against the bed. Her tail wagged weakly, but there was desperation in her movements, as if she needed him to know that she hadn't left him. She had stayed. She had fought for him. She had saved his life. Tears welled in the man's eyes. With slow, feeble movements, he lifted his hand, fingers brushing against her fur. Good girl, he rasped, his voice raw with emotion. You didn't leave? Maya whimpered, nudging her face against his chest, her body shaking from the sheer relief of seeing him alive. Jake swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in his own eyes. He had witnessed plenty of reunions in his line of work, but none like this. None that carried this kind of weight. This wasn't just a pet greeting her owner. This was a mother who had endured unimaginable hardship, who had refused to let go, who had risked everything to make sure her family, both human and canine, survived. The old man, whose name was Thomas, was still too weak to tell his full story. But through broken words and exhausted pauses, Jake and the doctors pieced together what had happened. A week earlier, Thomas had taken Maya out with him to gather supplies from a neighboring town. It was supposed to be a short trip, just a few hours. But the weather turned unexpectedly brutal, a storm sweeping in faster than predicted. On his way back, Thomas had slipped on the ice, breaking his ankle. He had tried to crawl to safety, but the cold drained his strength, and before long, he could barely move. Maya had stayed by his side, tried to keep him warm. But as the blizzard grew worse, she made a decision. She had to protect her puppies. Jake realized then what had happened. Maya had been pregnant when Thomas set out for supplies. And out there, in the middle of the snow-covered wilderness, she had given birth alone. Somehow, through sheer instinct and determination, she had kept them alive. And when she had sensed that Thomas was fading, she had done the only thing she could. She had waited. She had endured. And when help had finally arrived, she had led them back to him. Sarah arrived at the hospital later that afternoon, carrying a small crate. The moment she stepped inside the room, Maya's ears perked up. She stood quickly, her eyes locked onto the crate with a mother's urgency. Sarah set it gently on the bed, opening the latch. And one by one, the tiny German Shepherd puppies were placed beside their mother. Maya let out a soft whine, this time one of joy, of relief. She licked each of her puppies, checking them, nudging them close. They wriggled and nestled against her warm body, safe once more. Thomas's hand shook as he reached out, brushing his fingers against one of the tiny pups. His eyes, wet with emotion, turned to Maya. You kept them alive, he whispered. Jake felt his throat tighten. She did more than that, he said softly. She saved you too. Thomas turned to him, gratitude and awe written across his face. How did you find me? Jake exhaled, glancing down at the loyal shepherd curled around her puppies. She led us to you. Thomas blinked, his frail fingers stroking Maya's fur. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, as if he finally understood. She hadn't just been surviving. She had been waiting, knowing, somehow, that she couldn't give up, that he was still out there. That help would come. The days passed, and Thomas grew stronger. Though the doctors warned that he would need time to recover, he was alive, because of her. Word of the miraculous rescue spread quickly. People marveled at Maya's intelligence, her unwavering loyalty, and the sheer impossibility of what she had endured. Experts called it instinct. Some called it a miracle. But Jake knew the truth. It was love, the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog, between a mother and her young, between two souls who refused to let go. 1 week later, Thomas was discharged from the hospital. When he returned home, it was with all of his family, Maya, her puppies, and a heart overflowing with gratitude. Jake and Sarah visited often, checking in, making sure they had everything they needed. But as time passed, they knew Maya's story wasn't just one of survival. It was one of faith, of strength, of a mother's undying love. And as Jake watched Thomas sitting on his porch, surrounded by wriggling puppies and a German shepherd who never left his side, he realized something. Some rescues weren't just about saving a life. Sometimes they were about proving just how powerful love could be, even against the impossible, even against death itself. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the small cabin, its rays melting the last remnants of snow clinging to the ground. It had been a harsh winter, but now, with the promise of spring in the air, everything felt new. Maya lay on the porch, her head resting on Thomas's lap as he sat in his old wooden rocking chair. His hand, still frail but gaining strength each day, gently stroked her fur. The puppies tumbled and played nearby, their tiny tails wagging with boundless energy. Watching them, Jake couldn't help but smile. A week ago, this place had been nothing more than a frozen grave waiting to happen. Now it was filled with life, warmth, and the undeniable presence of love. Thomas exhaled deeply, his fingers tracing Maya's ears. I still can't believe it, he murmured. She could have left. She could have run off, tried to save herself. But she didn't. Jake nodded, leaning against the porch railing. She did what any mother would do. She protected her family, and she never lost faith that someone would come. Thomas's gaze drifted to the puppies, who had now discovered a loose shoelace on his boot and were tugging at it with tiny growls. He chuckled, shaking his head. She's always been special, loyal. But this, his voice faltered for a moment, filled with emotion. This was something else. Jake knew exactly what he meant. There were plenty of stories about dogs showing incredible loyalty, of them braving fire, floods, and freezing cold to save the ones they loved. But something about Maya's story felt deeper. It wasn't just about survival. It was about faith. Faith that help would come. Faith that her puppies would make it. Faith that Thomas was still alive. She had waited on that ice, through the worst of winter, through hunger, exhaustion, and fear, because she believed in something bigger than herself. And in the end, she had been right. Sarah arrived later that afternoon, carrying a bag of supplies for the growing puppies. As she sat beside them, watching their tiny tails wag, she turned to Thomas. "Have you thought about names for them yet?" Thomas smiled, nodding. "I have." He reached down, gently scratching behind the ears of one of the pups, a slightly larger one with his mother's sharp eyes. "This one's Hope." Sarah's face softened. "That's perfect." Thomas pointed to another, a feisty little girl who had been the first to learn how to climb out of the blanket pile. "That's Faith." Jake raised an eyebrow. "And the rest?" Thomas chuckled. "Well, I think I'll have to get to know them a little better first. But one thing's for sure." He glanced down at Maya, his voice full of warmth. "They'll all grow up knowing their mother is the bravest soul I've ever met." Jake nodded, his throat tightening. He had seen courage in many forms. Firefighters running into burning buildings, paramedics fighting to save lives, soldiers risking everything for their country. But the kind of courage Maya had shown, it was different. It was pure. It was the kind of courage that comes only from love. Over the next few months, Maya's story spread far and wide. News stations picked it up, calling her a hero. People from around the world sent messages, donations, and even offers to adopt the puppies. But Thomas knew they belonged here, together. Maya had fought too hard for them to be separated now. And so, the little cabin became a home not just for Thomas, but for Maya and her growing pups. Every morning, they would run through the grass, their playful barks filling the air. And every evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Maya would curl up beside Thomas on the porch, just as she had always done. Only now, she wasn't waiting for a rescue. She had already found it. As Jake prepared to leave that day, he hesitated at the cabin door. There was one last thing he needed to say. He turned to Thomas. "You know, a lot of people will call this a miracle, and maybe it is." Thomas looked down at Maya, smiling softly. "Or maybe it's just love." Jake nodded, his heart full. "Yeah, maybe that's all the miracle we ever really need." As he drove away, the cabin grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but the feeling in his chest remained. Because some stories don't just end. Some stories, like Maya's, become legends. A reminder that love, in its purest form, is the most powerful force in the world. And that sometimes, the greatest heroes aren't the ones wearing capes. They're the ones waiting on the ice, refusing to let go, and believing with everything they have that love will always find a way. If this story teaches us anything, it's that love isn't just something we feel, it's something we prove. Through our actions, through our sacrifices, through the moments when everything seems lost, but we hold on anyway. Maya's story is a testament to that truth. And if a mother's love can endure against all odds, if a dog can wait, fight, and survive for the one she loves, then maybe we can all learn something from her. To never give up, to never stop believing, and to always, always choose love.